Hi, I'm Alex Bernard, Associate Editor for Potatoes in Canada, and I'm here today with Dr. HaleyCatton, Research Scientist in Entomology with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge, Alberta. Hi, Haley. How's it going?
Hi, Alex. Nice to see you.
Good. So today we are talking all about wireworms. What are wireworms?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak about wireworms. They are something that I think about day and night in my job as a research scientist. And let's talk about what they are. So we call them wireworms, but they're not worms at all. They are the larval stage of a beetle called click beetles. And let's just start with how you might see them in the field. So I know we're talking about potatoes today, but a lot of my photos are in pulses or cereals, and these are the same critters that'll be in your potato field. So here's a faba bean here, and here's your little yellow wireworm. Can you see the arrow on my screen?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So you can see where I'm pointing. So there's a wireworm there. You see it's a soil-dwelling pest, and it'll eat seeds, right? And it'll also chew stems. So here's some chewing damage from the wireworms. So in terms of potatoes, yes, you'll see chewing, tunneling, boring into potatoes. So what are they? They are the larval stage of a group of beetles called click beetles. We're talking about many, many species. On the prairies here, we have over 300 species of click beetles, but only a few of those are pest wireworms. But let's just talk about their life cycle here. So what are wireworms? We're talking about a multi-year life cycle for most of the species that we deal with. And this audience is you're all from across Canada, right? So depending on what region of the country you're in, you're gonna have different species or sets of wireworm species. But in general, their life cycle is such that the adults will overwinter in the soil, right? And in the springtime, those adult beetles will emerge and they'll come to the soil surface where they'll find each other and mate if they need to. Not all species need to mate, but if they do need to mate, they will. And then they'll lay eggs in the soil. That's, in May and June. Those little eggs will hatch into new hatchlings, which we call neonates. So these are very, very small little wireworms. And at this stage of their life cycle, they're quite fragile. They're sensitive to dryness, moisture, and temperature as well. So if they survive their first winter, or their first summer, fall, and winter, right? They're all in the soil, then they stay in the soil, and next year we call them resident larvae. And this is when they're bigger and stronger and more aggressive feeders as well. And these are the ones that'll live in your soil for 3 to 5 years, a little bit more, a little bit less, depending on what species and what your soil conditions are like. These resident larvae are the ones that are gonna come up in the spring and feed on your seed pieces, for example, in your potatoes. Now, at some point in one of these summers of their life cycle, they'll reach some kind of point where they're ready to turn into adults. So then they become a pupa in the late summer, right? This is where they do their metamorphosis from wireworm larva into a new adult. And those new adults will stay in the soil. They build a little chamber in the soil and they'll overwinter there. They won't move, just overwinter there, and they'll wait for next spring when they become active. So you see like multiple years for them to go from egg to adult, but they're only an active adult just for a couple of weeks in that spring of that 1 year of their life. And most of the time, I know, right? Most of the time they're in this wireworm stage, which is unfortunately for us, the damaging stage. The adult beetles don't cause direct damage to crops. They don't feed that much. The damage they cause is making new wireworms that will eat your crop.
Okay.
So why are they so difficult, right? First of all, dealing with anything in the soil, as you know, as potato growers, right? Soil, you can't see through it, and it's heavy. Things can move in it. It's just difficult to sample things in the soil. Wireworms can also be patchy. So that means some fields will have problems, some won't. Even within a field, you'll have certain areas with problems, certain areas won't. So that makes them really hard to monitor. They're mobile in the soil. So remember, these neonates and these residents, they can move. They can move up to the soil surface when your seed pieces are there or your cereal or pulse seeds are there. They can move down 70 centimeters or more when they want to overwinter, where it's a little bit warmer or a little bit more moist. So they can move up and down. So if you try to sample them when they're down low and you're sampling the top of the soil, you might miss them, right? You might say, hey, I didn't catch any, great, but they're still there.
Oh
So
dear.
makes it difficult, I know, yeah. And this is a major challenge in dealing with this pest, is that it's hard to tell when you have it and how bad it is. We're also talking about multiple species. So like I said, depending on where you are in the country, there'll be different species. If you're in BC or the Atlantic provinces, you have European species of wireworms, which are invasive species. If you're in the prairies where I am, we have a series of native species. We're talking about insects with long life cycles, like multi-year life cycles, different than a lot of pests. We're talking insects that eat multiple crops. So crop rotation is not very effective if you're trying to reduce these things. They can also take a year off without eating if they don't like what you planted this year. Or even if you go into fallow for a year, they can take a year off, go deep into the soil where it's dark, moist, and come back next year. And until recently, pesticides haven't killed them. So in certain fields that are good habitats, the wireworm numbers have been just climbing up and up and up and up because there's been nothing to knock them back. Now, anytime we talk about pests like click beetles and wireworms, I try to always remind everyone that pests are living in the exact same time and place as a whole bunch of beneficial insects in the fields. So here's some really nice, beautiful photos of two of our pest click beetle species on the prairies. These photos are by Julian Sagues in Quebec. He's just a wonderful collaborator and photographer. So I want to show you just briefly how to differentiate between a click beetle, which is a pest, and a ground beetle, which are beneficials.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're all running around at the same time in the same place, right? And
just to make
some
it more
of them,
complex.
Yeah, some of them we want to kill, and some of them we definitely don't want to because they're doing good work for us. So click beetles, you see, this is called a pronotum, but you know, when I'm talking to non-entomologists, let's just call it the shoulders. The shoulders of this beetle, of click beetles, always have a point here, right? And on this species, the point is there and there, and that's what they use. They actually click. Click beetles actually click. So if you have a live one in the field and you turn it over on its back, it'll hook these little points, put this hook under its wing covers, kind of hook and then make this tension and then click. And then that tension of the force like propels it up in the air and it spins around and it's like a big jump, big click. So that's what click beetles have, those little points on their shoulders. And you look at ground beetles, these are beneficial predators. They cycle nutrients, they'll eat weed seeds. These are good guys. And we call them field heroes. And you'll see that they don't have those points on the shoulders. They'll also have a different body shape. So some of them, like click beetles, are usually kind of bullet shaped. Mm-hmm. And this ground beetle is a little bit bullet shaped, but this one here has a bigger abdomen. So even though these are all kind of dark colored, shiny beetles, they're different. And these ground beetles, we want to keep them, save them. Look at the mandibles on this one, right? This is for eating your soft-bodied cutworms and pests and wireworms in your field.
Yes.
So anyway,
we want all of those to stay.
Yeah. So like Alex, you and I were just talking about using surgery as an analogy of controlling pests. We want to get into a field and remove the pests and leave these other ones untouched if we can. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to highlight that we have a new field guide coming out from Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada on pest wireworms on the Canadian prairies. This guide focuses, like I said, on the prairies, also cereals and pulses. We talk about potatoes, but that's not the focus of the guide. It's written by myself and several other colleagues from across the country. It's part of a project that was funded by the Alberta Wheat Commission and WGRF and AFC. And we're releasing it in early 2021. So we're just in the final stages right now of layout. And there will be free hard copies for distribution, and there'll be a PDF that you can download from the government website, all for free, in English or in French. And the field guide is, it has turned into a beautiful piece of work. We talk about the background of wireworms on the prairies, what we know about them, what the species are, what we know about their life cycles, integrated pest management options, research needs, and there are just beautiful photographs of the prairie pest species. So here's our cover shot, and here are 4 main pest species of wireworms on the prairies. This is like the larval stage, right, and the adult stage.
Hmm.
And this is all to scale, so you'll see that these different species have different sizes, and you'll also see they'll have different behaviors. So I can go, whoops, so I can talk about on this slide here. So through some of the work from my group and our collaborators, we found from sampling, right, we found these species are the pest species on the prairies. And 3 of them have common names. The most numerous one here doesn't. And in my work in Southern Alberta, that was 59% of them that we found was this one species. But like I said, just looking at them, you see differences in size. Here's what they look like in the adult stage, each one of these species. So you see, notice the points, right? Click beetle points. This species, they're harder to see. They're a little bit more blunt, but they're still there. There's a point, there's a point. The way we can tell them apart in the field is by looking at their hind end. So this is the 9th abdominal segment of their bodies, and all of them have a different shape here. And that's how we identify wireworms. So the field guide is going to have detailed photos of this so that you can do some rough identifying in the field yourself to see what species you have. And why would you even want to know what species you have is because they're different. It's actually very, very interesting the more you learn about them. This is just for the prairies, right? But let's talk about this most numerous one here, Hypnoidus. It lives in the soil for 2 to 3 years. Some populations in the prairies are all females, and some populations are mixes of males and females. So they don't always need to mate to maintain themselves. We don't know how many eggs an adult female will lay, and we know that the larvae are smaller, more active, and more aggregated in the field, or more clumped than the prairie green wireworm, this one here. And we know the adults will fly, which affects how they would move between fields. Let's look at the prairie green wireworm. This has been the most famous species on the prairies. It used to be the most numerous too. And it's big, right? It's very beefy looking and big. And it also has a longer life cycle. So there's a study that measured how many years are these things spending in the soil. They found between 3 and 11 years, and 11 years is when they stop measuring. So, they can live a long time in your field, which, it makes them hard to manage. Mm-hmm. We know this species needs to mate. We know that the females will produce a male pheromone perfume to attract the males. Look at how many eggs they can lay per female, hundreds. And we know the feeding behavior of this species is different than Hypnoidus, and that the way they eat will destroy 3 to 10 times more seeds than the other species. And that involves them eating the growing point of a seed as opposed to just any part of the seed. Okay. And interestingly, in this species, the adults have not been observed to fly. So they walk, that's all. Yeah, I know, right? Now check out this next one, the flat wireworm over here. Talking very different than the other ones in that it can complete its whole life cycle in a year under good conditions, but probably spends 2 years usually to complete. And there's never been a male found in Canada, ever, all females. Not that many eggs per female, and it has a different feeding behavior where it'll cut plants rather than shred them. Okay. And the larvae are really active. Like if you held one of these in the palm of your hand, it's hard to prevent it from escaping off the side of your hand. Like they're really fast, and they're predators too. So are they eating other wireworms in the soil? Probably. We don't know what's going on down there. And the adults will fly. And then let's look at this last one, Limonius californicus. This one in my study was only 5%, but I focused on dryland fields, and in irrigated fields where you'd see a lot of potato production, there's more of these. And all we know about them is that about their life cycles is from work done in California in the 1940s. So there's a question mark here. We think 2 to 3 years in the soil. It's new in Alberta since the 50s. It needs to mate. It makes a sex pheromone. It'll lay hundreds of eggs per female, and it's most prevalent on irrigated land. Okay. So what's really interesting too is that if you have a field, you don't just have one of these. They come in kind of blends. And I just want to show a few results from the study I did in southern Alberta, where we have on the y-axis, we have the number of wireworms per soil core, 2 soil cores here. And then all of these are fields along the bottom. And then their rotation. So that we have sampled each of them in the year that they were planted in wheat. But the previous 2 years, they either had canola cereal or cereal canola or cereal or pulse canola. And then all the colors that are going to show up are different species. And I just want to make the point here that look at the variation among these fields of which species they have in the blends. So almost none of these fields have just one species, maybe this one here,
Yeah,
right? But most of them have a blend. You're talking at least 2 and sometimes 3. Look at this one, 4, 5, five species in this field. So wireworms are so variable field from field, you know, and that's the point I want to make here. We did, oh, and here's what irrigated fields look like in our sampling. Not that many, but I think some of these were fields that were used in potato production. And I think we didn't detect them because we were sampling soil cores the top 10 centimeters, and potato fields had fluffier soil. So I just think we didn't get deep enough to actually find where the wireworms were. Anyway, we didn't detect a crop rotation effect, which was very interesting.
So we have a very good overview of what wireworms are and kind of how to find them to the degree that we know how to find them now. How do they affect potato crops specifically?
Yeah, so potatoes are a little bit different than cereals and pulses in the fact that you can have, or you're concerned about the tubers that you plant in the spring, right? That's when wireworms do most of their feeding is in the spring. But really, a potato grower is mostly concerned about the daughter tubers, right? That they're going to be harvesting in the fall. So wireworms probably won't reduce biomass production very much in potatoes, but they will reduce market value because they leave these holes, right? And the holes can get rotten and infected and they're unsightly. So for potato growers, they have to be worried about summer and fall feeding of wireworms. That means that they're worried about the resident wireworms, right? The ones that have already overwintered, but also those new hatchlings. Those new hatchlings are going to eat in the fall. So for chemical control, at least of wireworms and potatoes, potato grower would have to think a little bit differently than a cereal grower. Cereal grower needs their crop to get established. And if the wireworms start feeding again in July, well, that's okay. The crop is strong enough to take it. But if you're a potato grower, you can't have those wireworms feeding in July. So that means that the chemicals that are used, if they're applied during planting, like an in-furrow application, they need to be chemicals that kill those neonates too, or incapacitate the resident wireworms, but also the neonates to last the whole summer and fall until harvest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, chemical or otherwise, what tools do growers have to combat wireworms?
Right. Well, the really, truly, in the short term, the main tools are chemical applications right now. In the long term, we're looking at more integrated pest management solutions, kind of attacking the wireworms from different parts of their life cycles. But short term, right now, it is chemical application. So where we would like to focus research efforts in the short term is to help producers decide when they need to invest in a chemical tool.
Okay.
So it's up to a producer to decide, obviously, right? But we need to help people figure out how to determine, okay, do I have a wireworm problem? And do I need to treat for it?
All right, so scouting is key at this. Scouting is key to discover wireworms.
Yes.
What signs should growers look for?
Yeah, so most of the time people will find out they have a wireworm problem when they harvest their potatoes and see holes everywhere, right? So you obviously want to be scouting before that. So if I was putting a field into potato rotation, I would look the previous year. I would, like whatever crop you're rotating the previous year, I would scout that one. But it has to be, the best scouting for them is in the spring. They're the most active in like May in the soil, May, June. So I would scout that field, I guess the spring before that you try to plant. And
Okay.
if you detect wireworms, then you have to investigate a bit more. And I wish we had economic thresholds, but we don't yet. The science isn't there yet for that. So as a scientist, I can't tell you how many wireworms you need to be worth it to treat. And that's where, personal judgment and risk acceptance will come in to the individual producer.
Yeah. At this point, they have to make the decision for themselves.
Yeah, well, they always do, right? I just want to be sure
sure.
they always do, but we don't have the tool to be able to inform their decision by saying, hey, if you catch 5 wireworms in a trap, then that's too many. We don't have that information right now, but we'd like to get there. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say is the most important thing growers should keep in mind regarding wireworms?
Oh, I have to pick one thing.
Just one, unfortunately.
Okay, think because they have a long life cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your wireworm management and scouting starts several years before you put your potatoes in that one field, right? It has to. So you can monitor a field several years before your potatoes go in, and that'll help inform your decision when potatoes go in. Do you need to apply that in-fur insecticide or not? Because you'll say, well, the last 2 years I haven't found a single wireworm. So maybe you don't need to. Or you say the last 2 years in this field, I found a bunch of them, and maybe you need to. So you have, I guess, wireworms, you got to play the long game.
All right.
They're not a boom and bust kind of insect. They are a long, slow build in any field.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catton.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. If anyone has any questions, you can reach me by email, and I can send you that information, Alex.
Perfect.
I'm also on Twitter too, at HaleyCatton. So I like to be active on Twitter. I love hearing from producers and what their concerns are. So those are 2 places that you can find me.
Excellent. We'll be sure to include that. And we'll include something for field heroes too, because I imagine
that's great.
They'd appreciate that. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for spending so much of your afternoon with me. This was fantastic.
Thanks so much, Alex. Have a good week.